Okay, so today we're reacting to a recent Ichabod podcast episode. Brady Goodwin, a former rapper who's currently skeptical of Christianity, interviewed another gentleman who's also lost their faith. Both of them really sharp guys. I really enjoyed the conversation. But what stuck out to me was the guest's core issue. He couldn't see how the Old Testament and New Testament connect. What's the continuity between the two? Let's check out that clip.
I'm not going to stop believing in God, but it's creating a conflict in me where I don't know what to do moving forward other than let's just keep learning. Let's just hear what they're saying. Let's revisit the Old Testament. That's what it made me do. It made me revisit the Hebrew writings. And the more I read the Hebrew writings, the more I really began to question the New Testament. Because I was trained in my head, the New Testament informs the Old, not the other way around. But then I began to realize that this revelation of Jesus is supposed to be founded on the revelations of the Old.
You know the saying, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed.
Right. And as I began to learn more, that's when debate started to arise. And I was like, no, I don't agree with that.
Now, if you have that same question, or let's even throw in a few bonus questions. Today you might be wondering, is Jesus a failed prophet? Did he really return at the end of that generation? Is God going to burn people for eternity? Did God already choose those he would burn forever? Is God saving us from a hell that he created? And what about Jesus' divinity? Is Jesus Yahweh? That might be a lot to tackle in one episode, but we're only going to look at one passage, and it gives some clarity on all these topics. You know, I've already been through a pretty stressful deconstruction myself, so my suggestion is to take it slowly. Even if you see truth in what I'm about to share with you, don't take it to mean every tradition, every dogma has to come rushing back in. Test every premise because faulty premises lead to bad conclusions. This is true for both Christians and skeptics. In fact, we're going to review some videos by secular scholars so you can see these faulty premises in some of their arguments as well. We'll probably start with Justin from Deconstruction Zone, another sharp guy, but he's off a bit on how he handles these prophecies about the final exile. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the final exile. So in the Old Testament, we see Israel exiled multiple times for sin under the Mosaic law. But there are prophecies in the Old Testament about a long final exile, after which they never be uprooted again. We looked at this in our Amos 9 video. The sequence goes: fall of Jerusalem, survivors scattered, nations then turn to the God of Israel, Israel regathered, many nations come against Israel in battle, Israel is saved or delivered from those nations, and the nations themselves are left desolate. Then the climax, 9:15. I will also plant them in their own land, and they will not be uprooted again from their land which I have given them, says the Lord your God. So Israel is looking forward to a time when they would not be exiled from the land again. And many passages across the Old Testament point to this final restoration, this restoration from which they wouldn't be uprooted again. And one of those passages is Joel chapters 2 and 3. Joel chapter 3 ends by saying, but Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. And I will avenge their blood, which I have not yet avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. Forever here, the Hebrew word olam, doesn't mean eternity, but a long time, for an age or ages. And since we see Joel 3 culminate in that final restoration, we know it's a final exile prophecy. And we can back up then to Joel chapter 2 and see that sequence of events I shared with you. So we should expect to see the fall of Jerusalem. And we do. But Joel chapter 2 is also, as most know, the second coming. Matthew 24 is probably the most famous second coming passage, and it's built actually on Joel chapter 2. And here's one of the links the gentleman in the video was looking for. Matthew 24 is Joel chapter 2. But if Joel chapter 3 comes after Joel chapter 2, obviously, it means the second coming was never meant to be a time-ending, earth-ending event. And you'll see that clearly as we work through this. And we won't read all of Joel chapter 2 and 3. We're just going to stitch together the common verses. So if Joel chapter 2 is Matthew 24, what do you think Joel chapter 3 is? It's Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. But don't most Christians think Matthew 25 is a hell passage? If you keep up on YouTube, we've actually heard that recently. Check out this clip.
You guys spoke on hell. Mm-hmm. And I think if I can remember, George's take on it was that he doesn't feel that it's eternal. Mm-hmm. He feels like it. Okay. And so do you want to elaborate on what you believe as far as hell goes?
Yeah, I would say as far as I'm seeing in the scriptures right now, hell seems to be eternal. And that's based on Matthew chapter 25, where I actually pointed it out in the podcast. People go back and watch. The scriptures seems to suggest they'll go into eternal paradise and these people will go into eternal damnation. That seems to be with what's kind of plain in the scriptures. Now, George takes a more annihilationist view.
Now, we'll come back to that at the end. But let's start with Joel chapter 2. It says, blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble. Matthew 24. Then those who were in Judea, let them flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what's in the house. They're giving us the scope of the passage. Zion, Judea. Matthew 24 is not about a worldwide judgment. The scope is Judea. There is a wider judgment prophesied, but that wasn't the second coming. Christ's first coming was to Judea, and his second coming was also to Judea. Joel 3 is the broader judgment. Matthew 25 is the broader judgment, as we'll see in a second. The problem of understanding the text comes when we try to stretch Matthew 24 all the way up to that broader judgment that's in our future. A great and powerful people, their like has never been seen before, nor will be again after them, through the years of many generations. Matthew 24, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Notice he says until now. He's keeping the scope of the great tribulation in the frame he's talking. Until now, speaking of his day. And what we see is we're talking about a great and powerful people and army coming into the land. Joel 2. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. We see the connection between the two. Joel says poetically, before them, before that army, before that great people, the sun will be darkened. This is a prophecy about Rome's invasion of Jerusalem, of Judea. And I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Many unaware, but Josephus reports a comet hung in the sky for about a year around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Many took that to be an omen. Then we come to Joel 2:32. This verse is loaded. The whole New Testament can actually be seen in Joel 2:32. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. The generation that wrote the New Testament was living out Joel chapter 2. When Jesus said, this generation will not pass, till all these things we see here in Joel chapter 2 were fulfilled. And when Peter said he was living in the days prophesied by Joel, they knew what they were talking about. They weren't repurposing Joel. They weren't borrowing from Joel. They were living the prophecy from Joel chapter 2. And we're not talking about just the gospel and Acts. Throughout the New Testament, the letters, the epistles, and Revelation included. We see these concepts pop up. Saved. Many verses in the New Testament that we use, that we think of as being saved from the death of our souls in the afterlife, are actually about salvation from wrath in the first century. I'm not saying there's no salvation for our souls from death in the afterlife, but we have to be careful when we look at those passages and make sure that we understand what the passage is talking about when it uses the word salvation, especially when it's borrowing from Joel chapter 2, because we see the scope of Joel chapter 2 is salvation from the army that entered into the land. So when Peter says, be saved from this perverse generation, well, when Jesus said, he that endures to the end will be saved, they're talking about this wrath. Or even when he says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, they're pointing you back to Joel chapter 2. And what else did Jesus say about that? He said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. When people say Jesus never claimed to be God, he's literally saying, I am the Lord Yahweh from Joel chapter 2. You'll also see in a second that he's also the Yahweh who's speaking in Joel chapter 3. And what's he saying here? He was saying two things. You could be saved from the judgment, but not be taken with him to heaven in the resurrection and rapture in the first century. And he's also saying that those who were with him were supposed to continue with him. They were supposed to continue to do the will of the Father in order not only to be saved from that wrath, but to be taken to heaven to reign with him. So when he says those whom the Lord calls, this is the elect, the chosen, or the predestined. When the New Testament says he will gather his elect, or you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. Or in Romans 8:30, and those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. These are the called spoken of here in Joel chapter 2. The elect are also called the first fruits. Romans 8:23, and not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. That adoption for them happened at the fall of Jerusalem. As Jesus said, when you see all these things, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. Their redemption was then. And many people think Israel was completely cut off at that time, and everything then shifted to the Gentiles. And many, like Justin from Deconstruction Zone, he believes that Jesus didn't fulfill everything that he was supposed to fulfill because not all Israel was saved at that time. But that's why they're called first fruits. That's why they're called the elect. Romans 11:16 says, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. So what's happening here? He asks, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. The first fruits received the promise. They were those who were saved from their enemies at that time, and they were taken to heaven to be with Christ. They received the promise. And back to Matthew 7, those who didn't do the will of the Father were assigned a place with the hypocrites. They had to go through that judgment. Jesus said, and I will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's not talking about an afterlife hell. He's talking about the judgment here in Joel chapter 2. So what about Israel beyond the fall of Jerusalem? Descendants of those who were hardened, those who actually made it through that judgment, their descendants would be saved from their enemies later. That's Joel chapter 3. It would be after the scattering, after the nations turn to the God of Israel, when the nations then come against Jerusalem a second time. Then we see what Paul was saying in Romans 11:25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. So when Paul says in this way, he's saying the elect are saved now, judgment will happen, the rest of Israel, the whole lump will be saved after the Gentiles come to the God of Israel. And as Paul said, the first fruits were the first to receive the Spirit as well. And we see the prophecy of the rest of them receiving the Spirit in Ezekiel 37:14. And I will put my Spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. So it was always meant to be this way. This is not a situation where the plan of God failed and then a secondary plan had to happen. This was already laid out in the Old Testament. And as you can see, this is a final restoration prophecy after the regathering. In this way, the elect at the fall of Jerusalem, the rest at the final battle of the age. So how much of this sequence do we actually see in the New Testament? Is the scattering in the New Testament? Look at Luke 21, it's the companion passage to Matthew 24. They will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Paul said until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. Luke says until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Until. That's where Joel 3 picks up. For those who say the Bible isn't relevant for us today, let's get it. Joel chapter 3 verse 1. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. Restore their fortunes from what? From the destruction that happened in Joel chapter 2. My great army, which I sent among them, the great people. Restoring the fortunes is a Mosaic covenant term. We won't go into it, but look at Deuteronomy chapter 30 to understand what restoring their fortunes actually meant. Behold, I will stir them up from the place in which you have sold them. Consistent with what we just read. They will be led captive into all nations. Continuing, it says, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land. Matthew 25, built on top of Joel 3, before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Jesus said he was doing this in Matthew 25. Joel 3 says this is Yahweh. We see the divinity of Christ again. Let the nations stir themselves up and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. The valley of decision, the separation of the nations one from another, sheep and goats. And why is he doing this? For they have cast lots for my people, and have traded a boy for a prostitute, and sold a girl for wine. For you have taken my silver and my gold, and carried my treasures into your temples. You see, he's identifying himself with his people. My silver, my gold, my rich treasures. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Notice in both passages, he's identifying himself with the suffering of his people. What was done to them was done to him. You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their own border. And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. And the common interpretation of this is that anything done to the poor in spirit is what Jesus was talking about here. But when he's talking about his brothers, he's talking about the sons or the descendants of Jacob, the 12 tribes. Remember, Paul also saw his brothers about to undergo that punishment, back to Romans 9. For I wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. Again, this is the context of Romans 9 through 11. Paul's not talking about going to an eternal torment. He's talking about not being one of the elect, identifying with his brothers, going through that wrath in the first century. He's saying if I could take that punishment for them, I would, but they were about to go through it. But here in Joel 3, the restoration from that wrath is prophesied, and the Lord continues to identify with their suffering. What are you to me, Tyre and Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you paying me back for something? If you are paying me back, I will return your payment on your own head, swiftly and speedily. The regions of Philistia would be Gaza today. The regions of Tyre and Sidon would be Lebanon today. I'm not making any connections, but it's interesting. What you see here is commonly called Messiah ben Joseph, or the Messiah son of Joseph, which means the Messiah as foreshadowed by the narrative of Joseph. And listen to the parallels. If you remember, Joseph was given a coat of many colors by his father. Jesus existed in the glory of the Father before the world began. Joseph's coat was stripped from him, and he was sold into slavery. Jesus put aside his glory and took on the form of a servant. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. They said they would never bow to him. Jesus was rejected by his brothers, Israel. They said, we have no king but Caesar. Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife, but did not sin. Jesus was tempted in every way, yet was without sin. Joseph was falsely accused and sent to prison. Jesus was falsely accused, slain, and buried. Joseph was released from prison and went on to save Egypt from famine. Jesus was raised from the grave, saved the world. Joseph was exalted to the right hand of the Pharaoh. Jesus was exalted to the right hand of the Father. During the famine, Joseph's brothers fell on hard times. Jesus' brothers, the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, have lived under hard times and persecution while in exile from the land for the last 2,000 years. Joseph's brothers came seeking assistance and found themselves bowing before Joseph, just as had been prophesied, even though they had earlier rejected it. Jesus' brothers, though they have rejected him now, will return, and he will save them from their enemies, as we see here in Joel chapter 3 and Romans 11. Joseph was dressed like an Egyptian, and his brothers didn't recognize him after such a long time. Today, by the Jewish people, Jesus is seen as having to do with the Gentiles, but they will be reconciled, and they will recognize him. Hosea 3, 4, and 5 says, for the sons of Israel will live many days without a king or leader, without sacrifice or memorial stone, without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, the Messiah, Jesus, and will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. The priesthood ended at the fall of Jerusalem, the scattering, Joel chapter 2, Matthew 24, the regathering and reconciliation, Joel chapter 3, Matthew 25, 31 through 46. This reconciliation prophesied here in Hosea couldn't have happened until the fall of Jerusalem, because that's when the priesthood ended. But many Christians today say, well, the Jews in the land today, they aren't the real Jews because they don't recognize the Messiah. They're not following the laws of Torah. But Ezekiel 36 already prophesied that. First, let's link Ezekiel 36 to make sure you realize it's talking about the final exile. Verse 15 says, and I will not let you hear any more the reproach of the nations. and you shall no longer bear the disgrace of the peoples and no longer cause your nation to stumble, declares the Lord your God. This is a final restoration prophecy. But Ezekiel goes on to say, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord your God, it's not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came. This is after they had been scattered. They would be brought out of the nations, not for their own sake. We already read that Ezekiel said that once they were brought out of the nations, he would put his spirit in them, sprinkle clean water on them, and accept them again. Look at what Ezekiel 39 says, and I will place my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see my judgment, which I have executed, and my hand, which I have laid on them. This is the same judgment on the nations we're reading about here in Joel 3. The house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward. So don't worry that they don't know the Lord now. The prophets say after this great judgment, they will all know him from the least to the greatest. But I promise to talk about eternal fire and eternal punishment. What will happen to the nations that come against Israel? Joel says Egypt shall become a desolation and Edom a desolate wilderness for the violence done to the people of Judah because they have shed innocent blood in their land. In the first century, Jerusalem and Judea were judged for the innocent blood of the prophets and the righteous they had shed. Now that Israel is back in the land, the Bible prophesies another judgment, but this time on the nations for the blood of Jesus' brothers that had been shed while they were in exile. That's the parallel. And what's the corresponding verse in Matthew 25? Then he will say to those on his left, the nations that he had just separated, the sheep from the goats, part from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So how is that the same? Eternal fire, devil and his angels, Egypt becoming a wilderness, a desolation. How do those things correspond? Jude 1 verse 7 explains it for us. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Eternal fire is not an afterlife thing. Eternal fire is the age-enduring desolation of a nation and its people. The nations will undergo the same judgment that Judea and Jerusalem and the Jews have undergone for this age. There will be some nations that undergo that same judgment. That's what he's saying in verse 41. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, the age-enduring desolation, prepared for the devil, the slanderer, the false accuser, and his angels or his messengers. What does that mean? For that, we have to understand what they were talking about in that day, how they were thinking about the slanderer, the accuser of the brethren. This is not talking about a mythical creature. Look at what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. From the day of the gathering of the teacher of the community, the teacher of righteousness, until the end of all the men of war who deserted to the liar, the angels, the messengers, the men of war who deserted to the liar, the devil, the false accuser. This is actually a person or an institution, likely the priesthood in the first century. Thou shalt be about 40 years. Their understanding is the same as Matthew 24. This generation will not pass away until Joel 2 was fulfilled. And during that age, the wrath of God shall be kindled against Israel. As he said, there shall be no king or prince, no judge, no man to rebuke with justice. Back to Hosea, which we just looked at. But those who turn from the sin of Jacob, who keep the covenant of God, shall then speak each man to his fellow, to justify each man his brother, that their step may take the way of God, that they wouldn't stumble. Here he's pointing back to Malachi 3 and 4. And God will heed their words and will hear, and a book of remembrance shall be written before him, of them that fear their God and worship his name, against the time when salvation and righteousness shall be revealed to them that fear God. Then you shall distinguish once more between the just and the wicked, between the one that serves God and the one that serves him not. And he will show loving kindness to thousands of them that love him and watch for him for 1,000 generations. And just like we saw, Jesus said, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord, but only those who endure to the end. It says, all those members of the covenant who have breached the bound of the law shall be cut off from the midst of the camp, and with them all those who condemn Judah in the days of its trials. The Dead Sea Scrolls in the New Testament are saying the exact same thing. But all those who hold fast to these precepts, going and coming in accordance with the law, who heed the voice of the teacher and confess before God, saying, truly we have sinned, we and our fathers, by walking counter to the precepts of the covenant. Thy judgments upon us are just and truth. They shall rejoice, and their heart shall be strong, and they shall prevail over all the sons of the earth. God will forgive them and they shall see his salvation, because they took refuge in his holy name. The majority of the New Testament is written by and devoted to the people who were living through Joel chapter 2. And as we see here, the New Testament does speak of the time after the first century, but we misinterpret it. Matthew 25 is not about heaven and hell. It's pointing to the time of regathering and the judgment of the nations. And we'll get into it later, but Revelation does the same thing. The majority of Revelation is about the fall of Jerusalem. But when we see that city come down from heaven, many of us think of that as being heaven or eternity. When we say the gates of pearl or the pearly gates, the gates of that city were pearl, and that's where the pearly gates comes from. But when you connect that city to the Old Testament, we'll look at that later, but that's talking about the restoration of Jerusalem. The New Testament is pointing to the same thing that we see here in Joel 2 and 3, but we miss it sometimes because we misinterpret the symbols. We're thinking about ourselves as Gentiles, and we're trying to inject ourselves into the story a little too soon. The story is centered around Israel, and we have to understand how it relates to Israel first before we can then see how it relates to us as Gentiles. And we'll start adding that in later. Like I said, we add things in slowly. We want to make sure we have the foundation first before we start adding in these other concepts. And then in Joel, we're back to our verse. But Judah shall be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. How does that connect to Matthew 25? Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And you might say, well, don't Christians say Jesus is reigning now? Like, isn't the kingdom already here? The kingdom of heaven is within you, Jesus said. That's exactly right. Just as Revelation said, they were raised to reign with him during this period, the millennium that we're coming out of now. They were raised to reign with him in the kingdom of heaven. But what did Jesus say? Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. There's a day coming when the kingdom of God breaks into the earth. And then we'll see passages fulfilled like they'll beat their swords into plowshares. They will study war no more. The wolf will lay down with the lamb. All those passages that we see in the Old Testament about this new creation happens after Israel is regathered, after this great battle that's coming when they as a nation are saved and the nations are judged. Then we see the new heavens and new earth. Isaiah 65 verse 17, For behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. Listen, for behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. Remember earlier in 65, and we'll look at this a little later, how these passages jump from the fall of Jerusalem to the restoration of Jerusalem. The New Testament does it. The prophecies do it. If you're not reading with this in mind, you'll actually miss what the passage is saying. You think it all runs together. But you see, the new heavens and new earth happens when the new Jerusalem is created to be a joy for her people and a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping or the cry of distress. But we'll talk about this more as we go forward. I just wanted to lay the groundwork here. I know this was a lot to take in at one time, but we'll break this down and we'll look at each piece a lot closer. But I wanted you to see the whole sequence. Until then, we pray Jesus' prayer, Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Peace and have fun exploring all the extraordinary evidence.